Campaigns of political discredit, as well as accusation of immorality and debauchery, are historical elements that define the political arena. It is a well-known fact that gender is subtly used as a political weapon in the competition for power, especially to construct precise hierarchies of power to the disadvantage of women. This was the case of the duchesses Adelperga and Liutperga, daughters of the last Lombard king, who were the target of the late 8th century papal and Frankish propaganda in their effort to reconstruct recent past events. During this speech, I will examine the political role of Liutperga and Adelperga, focusing on both their activity in pursuing the interests of their relatives and their endeavors to oppose the Carolingians. Firstly, I shall outline the rhetorical figure of womanly influence in the early Middle Ages, highlighting the dichotomous view of the woman. Then, I shall consider in detail the Liutperga's case and the Adelperga's one. I will finish by answering the core question of this paper: were Adelperga and Liutperga worthy opponents of Charlemagne? The rhetorical figure of womanly influence has its roots in the classical Greek-Roman literature, but it also persisted within the Christian background. Both traditions described women's influence on men as dangerous because of the opposition between men's sense of duty and their vulnerability to female seduction. The most representative example quoted by many medieval sources is the temptation of Eve, whose figure was depicted as the prototype of the enchantress and evil woman. It is therefore not surprising that several early medieval queens were compared by their political enemies to the figure of the temptress par excellence, underlying their frail and wicked nature. However, there is not only a negative topos of womanly influence. On the one hand, as Kate Cooper stressed in her article Insinuations of Womanly Influence, woman is a seductress, bent on tempting a man by private allurements to a betrayal of public duty. But, on the other hand, the positive version dwells on a man's illicit relationships with female family members whose soothing charm will easily restore him to order when he has strayed and persuade him to hear the voice of reason. Building on this premise, I want to draw attention to the case study of Liutperga, whose spouse, the Duke of Bavaria, Tassilo III, was described by the Frankish and Papal propaganda as a man who subverted his political and military obligations, succumbing to the whims of his malevolent wife. Liutperga, daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius, was given in marriage to Tassilo III, first cousin of Charlemagne, around 763. Bavarian sources depict Liutperga as a duchess, deeply involved in the governance with her husband, and, like her sister Adelperga, she was a capable ruler. An example that reveals the importance of the duchess is the chalice of Tassilo and Liutperga, now conserved in the Kremmünster Abbey. At the base of the chalice there are two inscriptions, namely Tassilo Dux Fortis and Liutpric Virga Regalis. The term Virga in this case does not denote to a virgin, but it refers to the royal rod, or scepter, an allusion to the family tree of the Lombard royal line. Liutperga became Charlemagne's sister-in-law probably in 770, after he married her sister, whose name is not mentioned in the sources for a very specific reason. She was repudiated by Charles just a year after the marriage, allegedly, as Janet Nessel pointed out, due to his necessity to establish new alliances after the death of his brother Charlemagne in 771. What we know about this royal Lombard woman can largely be summed up by the fact that her name is unknown, which corresponds to a precise strategy of damnatio memoriae, firmly followed by the papal and Frankish propaganda. a strategy based on the discredit of the gens Lombardorum and their cruel and impious king, Desiderius. The repudiation of the young Lombard princes, as well as the humiliation inflicted on Desiderius and the Lombard people in 774, were affronts that Liutperga and Adelperga will never forget. After Charles had captured Pavia, deposed Desiderius and become king of the Lombards in 774, the relationship between Tassilo and Charles became increasingly tense, and it became quickly evident that the war was inevitable. From Charles' perspective, Tassilo was conducting a very independent policy and, besides, he was married to the king's daughter he had just deposed. In this context, it is important to analyze the role of Liutperga and especially the narration of the facts in one of the most important Frankish sources, the Annales Regni Francorum, in its two versions. This work is the result of a precise purpose of Charlemagne and his intellectual milieu, namely to reconstruct the recent past to their own advantage, justifying the Carolingians' claims and actions in order to increase the power of the God-blessed Frankish dynasty. The goal was always to discredit the opponent both through subtle strategies of damnatio memoriae and through charges of betrayal or breaking oaths, lack of self-control, and finally accusation of not respecting God's will. Clearly, women were not exempt from this political operation, but they were rather easy targets due to the widespread prejudice about their weak and vicious nature. Nevertheless, as Chris Wickham pointed out in reference to some Carolingian queens, it was their high profile, not their weakness, that exposed them to criticism. Regarding the year 788, the Annales reports that then the Lord King Charles summoned an assembly at the villa of Ingelheim, and Tassilo came there at the Lord King's command, as did also the rest of his vassi, and Bavarian faithful men began to say that, since giving his son and the other hostage and taking oaths, Tassilo, incited by his wife Liutperga, had not kept his faith safe, but been seen to betray it. The first version of the Annales described Liutperga as malevola uxor and hateful to God, accusing her of plotting with Avars to oppose the Franks. This way, the Annales discredits not only Liutperga but also Tassilo, since, as her husband, he was supposed to maintain control over his wife. A duke who had not even been able to rule his wife was not worthy to rule a country. Moreover, the second version of the Annales claims that Liutperga was a daughter of Desiderius and, as such, after her father's exile, had been constant and extreme in her enmity to the Franks. The claim itself was extreme, but it is plausible that Liutperga, in conjunction with her sister Adelperga, attempting to organize a formal resistance against Charlemagne. A clue to a contact between the two sisters can be traced back to 787, when Charlemagne was in Rome, close to threaten Benevento. Duke Arichis then sent his son Romuald to Rome with rich gifts, and his younger son, Grimoald, was chosen by the king as hostage. It is important to remember, however, that in Rome there were also two agents of Tassilo, namely Bishop Arn of Salzburg and Abbot Henrik of Wannsee, whose mission was to ask Pope Hadrian to settle a peace between the Lord King Charles and Duke Tassilo. As Janet Nelson pointed out in her essay, Making a Difference in 8th Century Politics, and her recent biography of Charlemagne, the contacts between Benevento and Bavaria might also involve the two sisters. It seems entirely conceivable that they contributed for their own reasons to concentrate action against their common enemy, namely Charlemagne, who had destroyed her father and dishonored his sister. The story of Liutperga ended tragically. Before her husband's arrest, she had found refuge with her daughters in Regensburg, bringing the ducal treasure with her. She probably hoped to keep control of the family fortunes, but her fate was instead to be exiled by Charles to a convent in France, where she died around 794. The case of Adelperga could be directly compared with Liutperga's one, even though it presents significant differences, especially regarding the epilogue. One of the most interesting historical accounts on Adelperga is the prologue of the Soria Romana, written by the duchess patron, namely Paul the Deacon. He accompanied the young Desiderius' daughter to Benevento, as she was given in marriage to the new Duke Arichis. In the prologue, Paul refers to her patron as Domina Adelperga, Christianissima Beneventi Doctrice, Coniux Domini Argis Sapientissimi et Catholici Princips, praising her intelligence and education, as well as her love for poetry, philosophy, and literature. A closer look to Adelperga reveals also that she was not only a dynamic patron interested in commissioning works, but also a powerful Lombard duchess, perfectly capable of managing difficult circumstances. In 786, Charles decided to visit Rome in order to address some problematic situations, especially those concerning the relationships between the papacy, the Franks, and Benevento. After threatening Arichis from Capua, Charles returned in France in 787, taking the duke's son Grimoald as hostage. Therefore, the duke immediately contacted Constantinople in order to demand support for the emperor and from Adelchis, Adelperga's brother, renewing his loyalty to the Lombard king in exile. Adelperga and her husband, thanks to their family ties, hoped to obtain soldiers and funding to defend their lands. Considering previous events, it is plausible to suppose that Adelperga, as well as her exiled brother, sought a form of redemption after so much humiliation. The death of Arichis, which occurred in 787, shortly preceded by that of his eldest son Romuald, however, did not stop these negotiations. Adelperga continued to conduct the business as a skilled politician, perfectly capable of holding the power. Some Capuans had arrived in Rome in 788 and had reported to Pope Hadrian that Adelperga had received in Salerno a Greek embassy led by 3 high personages who had then moved to Naples with some members of the Lombard entourage to organize a joint strategy. In a letter dated 787, Pope Hadrian complains the plot of the malevolent Adelperga against Charlemagne, begging the king to not free his son Grimoald for any reason. The Pope letter depicts the duchess like a cunning and sly woman, also claiming death. Bishop Leo has secretly informed us that Adelperga, Arichis' widow, has a plot according to which, as soon as Grimoald, her son, crosses the Benevento borders, she intends to take her 2 daughters with her and travel to Monte Sant'Angelo in the Gargano, and from there, since it is only 80 miles away, go to Taranto, where she has accumulated her treasures. It is interesting to note that the initial destination of Adelperga, the monastery of San Michele on Monte Sant'Angelo in Apulia, was located in an area that would allow her to join the Greek forces that were coming from the Adriatic. San Michele was also a sanctuary strongly linked to the Lombards, and, therefore, it could have represented all their hopes. In fact, during the period of Lombard domination, the sanctuary became one of the most famous spiritual centers among Lombards, who considered the archangel as the ideal figure of the protector warrior. Finally, the treasures of Adelperga in Taranto were supposed to help her brother Adelchis and his army, even though the confrontation did not happen that year. Charlemagne, this time, preferred diplomacy over war. He allowed Grimoald to return to Benevento only after an oath of loyalty. However, shortly after, the new prince restored the independence of the duchy, releasing it from any Frankish interference. In this presentation, I try to summarize the main key aspects of Adelperga's and Liutperga's agency, stressing how they were discredited by both Carolingian and papal propaganda. Viewed through the lens of their male political opposers, these two wicked sisters seem to be constantly plotting against the good King Charles, blinded by deep hatred. By forcing them in the topos of the malevolent and enchantress women, their enemies used the category of gender as a political weapon against them. Specifically, the reconstruction of the past by the Frankish and Papal propaganda had a twofold purpose. On the one hand, to undermine the prestige of the duchesses, whose political role was considerable. On the other hand, by criticizing the moral conduct of the two women, there was a subtle attempt to discredit their husbands, who were quite dangerous political opponents for Charles and the Pope. In conclusion, even in a prudent estimation, it is undeniable that these women played a key role in politics by keeping their queenship alive. Somehow, they continued to be Lombard duchesses, daughters of Desiderius, even after their marriages in foreign lands. And if Liutperga failed in her revenge, Adelperga succeeded in keeping the Lombard memory alive.